Hey, listening squirrels. Woo! Here's the hoping I can stay awake. We're on chapter 7, I think. The Good Witch, I think. Oh, a good many years, I believe. I suppose whoever had it thought it was too big or too inconvenient. Only wanted a weekend place or something of that kind, so they kept the good rooms, the dining, and I read this, but going back. And the drawing room, and made a kitchen out of a small study there was, and a couple of bedrooms and bathroom upstairs, and then walled it up, and let the part that was kitchens and old-fashioned sculleries and things, and did it up a bit. Who lives in the other part? Someone who just comes down for weekends? Nobody lives there now, said Mrs. Perry. Have another scone, dear? Thank you, said Tuppence. At least nobody's come down here in the last 2 years. I don't know even who it belongs to now. But when you first came here, there was a young lady used to come down here, an actress, they said she was. At least that's what we heard. But we never saw her, really, just caught a glimpse sometimes. She used to come down late on a Saturday night. After the show, I suppose. She used to go away on the Sunday evenings. Quite a mystery woman, said Tuppence encouragingly. You know, that's just the way I used to think of her. I used to make up stories about her in my head. Sometimes I'd think she was like Greta Garbo, you know, the way she went about always in dark glasses and pulled down hats. Goodness, now I've got my peak hat on. Oh, her hat that she had on. She removed the witch's headgear from her head and laughed. It's for a play we're having at the parish rooms in Sutton Chancellor, she said. You know, a sort of fairy story play for the children mostly. I'm playing the witch, she added. Oh, said Tuppence, slightly taken aback, and then added quickly, what fun. Yes, it is fun, isn't it, said Mrs. Perry. Just right for the witch, aren't I? She laughed and tapped her chin. You know, she said her nose and her chin kind of went together. She laughed, tapped her chin. You know, I've got the face for it. I hope it won't put ideas into people's heads. They'll think I've got the evil eye. I don't think they'd think that in you, said Tuppence. I'm sure you'd be a beneficent witch. Well, I'm glad you think so, said Mrs. Perry. As I was saying, this actress, I can't remember her name now, Miss Marchman, I think it was. But it might have been something else. You wouldn't believe the things I used to make up about her. Really, I suppose. I hardly ever saw or spoke to her. Sometimes I think she was just terribly shy and neurotic. Reporters would come down after her and things like that, but she never would see them. At other times I used to think, well, you'll say I'm foolish. I used to think quite sinister things about her, you know, that she was afraid of being recognized. Perhaps she wasn't an actress at all. Perhaps the police were looking for her. Perhaps she was a criminal of some kind. It's exciting sometimes making things up in your head, especially when you don't, well, you know, see many people. Did nobody ever come down here with her? Well, I'm not so sure about that. Of course, these partition walls, you know, that they put in when they turned the house into two, well, they're pretty thin. And sometimes you'd hear voices and things like that. I think she did bring down someone for weekends occasionally. She nodded her head. A man of some kind. That may have been why they wanted somewhere quiet like this. A married man, said Tuppence, entering into the spirit of make-believe. Yes, it would be a married man, wouldn't it, said Mrs. Perry. Perhaps it was her husband who came down with her. He'd taken this place in the country because he wanted to murder her, and perhaps he buried her in the garden. My, said Mrs. Perry, you do have an imagination, don't you? I never thought of that one. I suppose someone must have known all about her, said Tuppence. I mean, house agents, people like that. Oh, I suppose so, said Mrs. Perry, but I rather like not knowing, if you understand what I mean. "Oh, yes," said Tuppence, "I do understand. It's got an atmosphere, this house. I mean, there's a feeling in it, a feeling that anything might have happened. Didn't she have any people come in to clean for her or anything like that?" "Difficult to get anyone here. There's nobody near at hand." The outside door opened. The big man who had been digging in the garden came in. He went to the scullery tap and turned it on, obviously washing his hands. Then he came through into the sitting room. "This is my husband," said Mrs. Perry. "Amos. We've got a visitor, Amos. This is Mrs. Beresford." "How do you do?" said Tuppence. Amos Perry was a tall, shambling-looking man. He was bigger and more powerful than Tuppence had realized. Although he had a shambling gait and walked slowly, he was a big man of muscular build. He said, "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Beresford." His voice was pleasant and he smiled, but Tuppence wondered for a brief moment whether he was really what she would have called all there. There was a kind of wondering simplicity about the look in his eyes, and she wondered too whether Mrs. Perry had wanted a quiet place to live in because of some mental disability on the part of her husband. "Ever so fond of the garden, he is," said Mrs. Perry. At his entrance, the conversation dimmed down. Mrs. Perry did most of the talking, but her personality seemed to have changed. She talked with rather more nervousness and with particular attention to her husband, encouraging him, Tuppence thought, rather in a way that a mother might prompt a shy boy to talk, to display the best of himself before a visitor, and to be a little nervous that he might be inadequate. When she'd finished her tea, Tuppence got up. She said, "I must be going. Thank you, Mrs. Perry, very much for your hospitality. You'll see the garden before you go." Mr. Perry rose. "Come on, I'll show you." She went with him outdoors, and he took her down to the corner beyond where he'd been digging. "Nice, them flowers, aren't they?" he said. "Got some old-fashioned roses here. See this one, striped red and white? Commandant Beau Repair," said Tuppence. "Us calls it York and Lancaster here," said Perry. "Wars of the Roses. Smells sweet, don't it?" Lancaster. "Smells lovely. Better than them new-fashioned hybrid teas." In a way, the garden was rather pathetic. The weeds were imperfectly controlled, but the flowers themselves were carefully tied up in an amateurish fashion. "Bright colors," said Mr. Perry. "I like bright colors. We often get folk to see our garden," he said. "Glad you came." "Thank you very much," said Tuppence. "I think your garden and your house are very nice indeed. You ought to see the other side of it. Is it to let or to be sold? Your wife says there's nobody living there now." "We don't know. We've not seen anyone, and there's no board up, and nobody's ever come to see over it. It would be a nice house, I think, to live in." "You wantin' a house?" "Yes," said Tuppence, making up her mind quickly. "Yes, as a matter of fact, we're looking round for some small place in the country for when my husband retires. That'll be next year, probably. We like to look about in plenty of time. It's quiet here, if you like quiet." "I suppose," said Tuppence. "I could ask the local house agents. Is that how you got your house?" "Saw an advertisement first, we did, in the paper. Then we went to the house agents, yes." "Where was that? In Sutton Chancellor? That's your village, isn't it?" "Sutton Chancellor? No, agent's place is in Market Basing. Russell and Thompson, that's the name. You could go to them and ask." "Yes," said Tuppence, "so I could. How far is Market Basing from here?" "It's 2 miles to Sutton Chancellor, and it's 7 miles to Market Basing from there. There's a proper road from Sutton Chancellor, but it's all lanes hereabouts." "I see," said Tuppence. "Well, goodbye, Mr. Perry, and thank you very much for showing me your garden." "Wait a bit." He stooped, cut off an enormous peony, and taking Tuppence by the lapel of her coat, he inserted this through the buttonhole in it. "There," he said, "there you are. Looks pretty, does it? Looks pretty, it does." For a moment Tuppence felt a sudden feeling of panic. This large, shambling, good-natured man suddenly frightened her. He was looking down at her, smiling rather wildly, almost leering. "Pretty it looks on you," he said again. "Pretty." Tuppence thought, "I'm glad I'm not a young girl. I don't think I'd like him putting a flower on me then." She said goodbye again and hurried away. The house door was open, and Tuppence went in to say goodbye to Mrs. Perry. Mrs. Perry was in the kitchen washing up the tea things, and Tuppence almost automatically pulled a tea cloth off the rack and started drying. "Thank you so much," she said, "both you and your husband. You've been so kind and hospitable to me. What's that?" From the wall of the kitchen, or rather behind the wall, where an old-fashioned range had once stood, there came a loud screaming and squawking and a scratching noise, too. "That'll be a jackdaw," said Mrs. Perry. "Dropped down the chimney in the other house. They do at this time of year. One came down our chimney last week. They make nests in the chimney, you know." "What, in the other house?" "Yes, there it is again." Again the squawking and crying of a distressed bird came to their ears. Mrs. Perry said, "There's no one to bother, you see, in the empty house. The chimneys ought to be swept and all that." The squawking, scratching noises went on. "Poor bird," said Tuppence. "I know, it won't be able to get up again." "You mean it'll just die there?" "Oh, yes. One came down our chimney, as I say, two of them, actually. One was a young bird. It was all right. We put it out and it flew away. The other one was dead." The frenzied scuffling and squawking went on. "Oh," said Tuppence, "I wish we could get at it." Mr. Perry came in through the door. "Anything the matter?" he said, looking from one to the other. "There's a bird, Amos. It must be in the drawing-room chimney next door. Hear it?" It's come down from the jackdaw's nest." "I wish we could get in there," said Mrs. Perry. "Ah, you can't do anything. They'll die from the fright if nothing else." "Then it'll smell," said Mrs. Perry. "You won't smell anything in here. You're soft-hearted," he went on, looking from one to the other, "like all females. We'll get it if you like." "Why, is one of the windows open?" "We can get in through the door." "What door?" "Outside here in the yard. The key's hanging up among those." He went outside and along to the end, opening a small door there. It was kind of a potting shed, really, but a door from it led into the other house, and near the door of the potting shed were 6 or 7 rusty keys hanging on a nail. "This one fits," said Mr. Perry. He took down the key and put it in the door, and after exerting a good deal of cajolery and force, the key turned rustily in the lock. "I went in once before," he said, "when I heard water running. Somebody forgotten to turn the water off properly." He went in, and the two women followed him. The door led into a small room which still contained various flower vases on a shelf and a sink with a tap. "A flower room, I should wonder," he said, "where people used to do the flowers. See? A lot of the vases left here." There was a door out of the flower room. This was not even locked. He opened it, and they went through. It was like, Tuppence thought, going into another world. The passageway outside was covered with a pile carpet. A little way along there was a door half open, and from there the sounds of a bird in distress were coming. Perry rushed the door open, and his wife and Tuppence went in. The windows were shuttered, but one side of a shutter was hanging loose, and light came in. Although it was dim, there was a faded but beautiful carpet on the floor, a deep sage green in color. There was a bookshelf against the wall, but no chairs or tables. The furniture had been removed, no doubt. The curtains and carpets had been left as fittings to be passed on to the next tenant. Mrs. Perry went towards the fireplace. A bird lay in the grate, scuffling and uttering loud squawking sounds of distress. She stooped, picked it up, and said, "Open the window if you can, Amos." Amos went over, pulled the shutter aside, unfastened the other side of it, then pushed at the latch of the window. He raised the lower sash, which came gratingly. As soon as it was open, Mrs. Perry leaned out and released the jackdaw. It flopped onto the lawn, hopped a few paces. "Better kill it," said Perry. "It's damaged." "Leave it a bit," said his wife. "You never know. They recover very quickly, birds. It's fright that makes them so paralyzed looking." Sure enough, a few moments later, the jackdaw, with a final struggle, a squawk, flapping of wings, flew off. "I only hope," said Alice Perry, "that it doesn't come down that chimney again. Contrary things, birds don't know what's good for them. Get into a room they can never get out of it by themselves. Oh," she added, "what a mess." She, Tuppence, and Mr. Perry all stared down at the grate. From the chimney had come down a mass of soot, of old rubble, and of broken bricks. Evidently it had been in a bad state of repair for some time. "Somebody ought to come and live here," said Mrs. Perry, looking around her. "Somebody ought to look after it," Tuppence agreed with her. "Some builder ought to look at it or do something about it, or the whole house will come down soon. Probably water has been coming through the roof in the top rooms. Yes, looking at the ceiling up there, it's come through there. Oh, what a shame," said Tuppence, "to ruin a beautiful house. It really is a beautiful room, isn't it?" She and Mrs. Perry looked together round it appreciatively. Built in 1790, it had all the graciousness of a house of that period. It had had originally a pattern of willow leaves on the discolored paper. "It's a ruin now," said Mr. Perry. Tuppence poked the debris in the grate. "One ought to sweep it up," said Mrs. Perry. "Now what do you want to bother yourself with a house that doesn't belong to you?" said her husband. "Leave it alone, woman. It'll be just as bad a state tomorrow morning." Tuppence stirred the bricks aside with a toe. "Oh," she said with an exclamation of disgust. There were 2 dead birds lying in the fireplace. By the look of them, both had been dead for some time. "That's the nest that came down a good few weeks ago. It's a wonder it doesn't smell more than it does," said Perry. "What's this thing?" said Tuppence. She poked with her toe at something lying half hidden in the rubble. Then she bent and picked it up. "Don't you touch a dead bird," said Mrs. Perry. "It's not a bird," said Tuppence. "Something else must have come down the chimney. Well, I never," she added, staring at it. "It's a doll. It's a child's doll." They looked down at it, ragged, torn, its clothes in rags, its head lolling from the shoulders. It had originally been a child's doll. One glass eye popped out. Tuppence stood holding it. "I wonder," she said. "I wonder how a child's doll ever got up a chimney. Extraordinary." And that's all of 7. And we'll stop there. Chapter 8 is called Sutton Chancellor. Wonder if she's gonna rent that house. I guess we'll see later on. Y'all have a wonderful evening. If you're watching this in the evening, it's 10:10 here right now. Be sweet, don't be ugly, and I'll be on tomorrow at 5. These pretty Noros still here. Bye-bye.